I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Suketu Mehta. Suketu is a migrant who claims his home as planet Earth, the mothership. He was born in Calcutta, grew up in Bombay, and in 1977 moved as a teenager to Jackson Heights. Suketu says, "I am primarily a storyteller," and his first book, Maximum City, Bombay Lost and Found, was a 2005 finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. His most recent book, This Land is Our Land, An Immigrant's Manifesto, tells a story of America as a land of strangers and of the forces of inequality, violence, climate change, and colonialism pushing millions of migrants to flee their countries of origin. The book has been celebrated as a powerful, passionate, angry, and hopeful cry for justice by one of our finest writers. There are copies for sale, and Mr. Mehta will be signing them at the end of our program. Suketu lives in New York City and teaches journalism at NYU, and we welcome him back to Jackson Heights.
Thanks so much for inviting me here back home. I grew up on 83rd Street. And when I came here in 77, I went to high school at Monsignor McClancy, just across Northern Boulevard. It wasn't a happy experience at the time. I was one of the first minorities in the school. The teachers called me a pagan. I remember on my first day in the school, this kid with red hair and freckles comes up to me and says, "Lincoln should have never let him off the plantations." And I said, "But what's it got to do with me?" So, I'm familiar with the kind of Queens that has generated not only the people in this room, but also our current president. And so much of what's going on in the country is a war of these dueling queens. But I loved growing up here in what we call Jackson Heights. It's the Hindi and Urdu way of pronouncing it. And my parents made me stay here on 83rd Street when I went to NYU. They wouldn't let me live in the dorms because I might become Americanized. So I had to take the F train every day for 4 years. And I said, one way or the other, I'm getting into NYU housing, so I'm now an NYU professor, and I live in. But for my new book, which is, it's a book I've been working on for 10 years, it's a book about New York, a lot of the stories that I want to follow are right here in Jackson Heights. So I'm looking to come back here and live here for a while, so any leads on apartments most appreciated. Every New York conversation has to turn to real estate sooner or later. So I wrote this book in response to the present emergency. There's an emergency not just in this country, but all around the world. Today, there's 250 million people, including me, including many of the people in this room, who live in a country other than the one we were born in. So never have more human beings lived outside their birth countries. Never have more people migrated. And never have there been more resistance to this kind of migration. So the immigration debate in this country and in the West generally is, should we let immigrants in or not? Are they going to be good for America or England or France? How many should we let them let in? Should they be skilled or unskilled? Are they good immigrants or bad immigrants? It's all told from, it's all about what's in it for the countries that immigrants come to. And in my book, I take a different tack. What about the immigrants themselves? Why do they leave? Why would anyone leave their families, their language, their culture, their people, their food, their trees, their rivers? Why would they go across oceans and fences? Why would they come to these strange lands? And it's not to see the Statue of Liberty or the Eiffel Tower. People are moving because they have no choice because the rich countries have stolen the future of the poor countries. And my book begins with a story my grandfather once told me. So my grandfather was born in India and worked all his life in colonial Kenya, and then retired to London, where his son was living. So my grandfather is sitting in a park in North London one day, minding his own business, and this elderly British gent comes up to him and wags a finger in his face and says, "Why are you here? Why don't you go back to where you come from?" And my grandfather, who's from a business family, says, "Because we are the creditors. You came to my country, you took all my gold and my diamonds, you prevented my industries from growing, so you have stolen from us. We have come here to collect. We are here because you were there." And so, when my grandfather told me the story, I realized, well, it's actually true. Many of the people who are coming here and to England and to France and to the colonial countries because the colonial countries were there first. We ask people who come here, where are your visas? Have you come here lawfully? Ask yourself this. Has the West ever gone anywhere lawfully when they went into Latin America, when they went into Asia, when they went into Africa? Did any of them ever carry a passport, ask for a visa? And they went not to work, but to steal and to rob and to rape. When the British went into India at the beginning of the 18th century, India's share of world GDP was 23%, so almost a quarter of the world GDP. By the time they left 200 years later, India's share of world GDP had plunged to 4%. During the colonial period, the share of world GDP of all the colonial countries went from 20% to 60% of world GDP. So Europe didn't develop the colonies developed Europe. So colonialism is one big reason why people move. It wasn't just what they did when they were in these countries. It's the lousy colonial map making that resulted when they left. When the British left what's now India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, this was a country that had been one country for 5,000 years. They ruled by splitting Indians and Muslims and Christians and Sikhs against each other. It was a very conscious policy, divide and rule. That's the only way that a handful of British people could rule over this giant continent. And when they left, they brought in a barrister named Radcliffe, who'd never been to India, and gave him 5 weeks to draw 2 lines down a map, which today separate almost 2 billion people. And India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars since then because of this lousy colonial map making. The same thing in Africa. When the British went into Africa, if you look at a map of Africa, it's got all these straight lines. These are not natural lines. When we ask ourselves why are there all these wars in Africa, these tribal wars, it's because the colonial powers put their national boundaries straight through tribal homelands. And so most of these wars are about tribes trying to regather themselves into a particular community. When the colonists left, it's not, they didn't just leave and that was it. They left their corporations behind. So imperial colonialism was replaced by corporate colonialism. Today, developing countries lose 3 times as much to tax havens as all the foreign aid they receive. When the corporations go into these countries, they get together with the local elites and they rob these countries of the minerals, the resources that they have. This gentleman here who gives this wonderful performance on the balafon is from Guinea. And in my book, I was speaking to this little Guinean family who were in Tangier in Morocco. And they had come all the way from Conakry to try to get over to Spain because there was no future left for them in Guinea. It had been completely despoiled by first the colonists and then the corporations. So Guinea is not a poor country. It's got up to half the world's bauxite. But there's an American hedge fund called Oxif, which owns most of the minerals in Guinea. And the head of the Oxif corporation is a man named Dan Oak, who recently bought an apartment at 220 Central Park South, where the apartments go for $250 million. But he moved into this apartment without having to give up his previous apartment, which was a penthouse at 15 Central Park West, which only cost $100 million. Another hedge fund leader named Michael Cohen of the same corporation bought a 900-acre English estate. Now, this was around the same time that this hedge fund was paying hundreds of millions of dollars in fines for corrupt practices in Africa. But those fines went not to Guinea, they went to the SEC and the Justice Department. Every year, $150 billion leaves Africa alone for tax havens. And these tax havens are in British colonies like the Cayman Islands, the City of London. It's not just Britain and France. At one point, an American company, the United Fruit Company, which is now Dole Bananas, owned 42% of all the land in Guatemala. Imagine any company, far less a foreign company, owning 42% of all the land in the United States. The third reason why people leave is war. We, the United States, went into Iraq and launched an illegal and unnecessary war, which cost 600,000 Iraqi lives and set the whole region ablaze. Millions of Syrians had to flee, millions of Iraqis had to flee, and most of them, they fled not to the country that had caused the war, but to neighboring countries, to Lebanon, to Turkey, to Jordan. But by rights, if there was any natural justice, the 900-acre Bush ranch in Texas would be filled with tents housing Syrian and Iraqi refugees. You break it, you own it. Another reason why people leave, we see all these people who come here because of gang wars in the Northern Triangle, in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. Well, and homicide figures in these countries are like a civil war. They're higher than homicide figures in the Middle East. Why are all these people killing each other? It's because we sell them the guns to kill each other, and we buy the principal product that they have left to export, which is their drugs, and we relieved our prisons and exported the paramilitias like MS-13 to create these gangs. MS-13 wasn't born in these countries, it was born in the prisons of California. 75% of all the guns in Mexico come from the United States. 98% of all the guns in the Bahamas come from the United States. Anytime the UN tries to do anything concerted to stop this flow of guns into these countries, the NRA leans on the US government to stop any kind of UN action in its tracks. Small Arms Treaty, the US vetoed it. Any sort of progress on stopping this murderous flow of weapons, we, the United States, stand opposed to it. The fourth and biggest reason why people are moving and will be moving is climate change. By the middle of the century, according to the UN, over 1 billion people are going to be displaced by climate change. Temperatures in India this year were 123 degrees. By the end of the century, large parts of northern India and Bangladesh will be simply unlivable. The human body will not be able to go outside without roasting to death. 10,000 Indians and Pakistanis already roasted to death this year alone. Who caused it? The US is 4% of the world's population, but we put 1/3 of the world's excess carbon in the atmosphere. European countries, another quarter. We built up our economies by emitting these fossil fuels. Now we're asking these economies, the developing economies like India and China, not to do the same, not to emit, and they are emitting. But if you look at, historical emissions, who's put the bulk of the climate gases in the atmosphere? It's us. And we continue to do it. The average American uses as much energy as 35 Indians or 180 Ethiopians. The Pentagon alone emits more greenhouse gases than 140 countries. So, you know, these people are coming here because we were there and we continue to be there. Our corporations continue to be there. The actions of our government establish our presence there. So my book has these numbers, but it's also got the stories, because I went all around the world and spoke to migrants. I remember speaking to a Honduran mother, 23-year-old Honduran mother, last year in a women's shelter in Tijuana. And she had this adorable 18-month-old baby boy playing on her lap. And she had fled because her husband had witnessed a gang murder in San Pedro Sula in Honduras. And this was at the height of the family separation crisis. And, I loved this little boy. And I said to her, if she was going to apply for asylum, and she had a legitimate claim for asylum, well-founded fear. And I said, if you apply for asylum, this was at the height of the family separation crisis, they're going to take your little boy away from you, and they'll put him across the country somewhere. And she had tears in her eyes, and she said, you know what a mother's love is? This boy that I love more than my life, I would rather never see him again and know that he's safe somewhere, and that maybe someday I have some hope of seeing him alive, than have to put him in a hole 6 feet below the ground where I come from. This was the choice she was faced with. Also in Tijuana, I did some of the most heartbreaking reporting of my career. So the conversation about immigrants today, across Europe and in this country, is approaching incitement to genocide. We have a president who calls migrants robbers and rapists and murderers, looters. The language that he uses about these people who are just coming, these mothers and children. And most of all, there's this idea that they don't have the same family values that we do. Well, if you want to see family values, go to a place called Friendship Park. It's on the US-Mexico border. And there is actually a wall on the US-Mexico border. It goes all the way almost to the sea. And then right by the sea, there is a small patch of ground which was inaugurated during the Nixon administration called Friendship Park, where if you're on this side of the border and you want to see your families on the other side, you could go up there and you could meet your families. So in previous administrations, you could go there, you could hug them, you could have a picnic, and then you'd have to both go back to different sides of the border. And then during the Obama administration, during the Clinton administration actually, they put up these bollards, so you could still hug your family, but you couldn't sit down with them. Now there's a thick mesh fence, and I stayed there for 2 weeks, and I saw family after family meeting. I stood there as a Mexican man who hadn't met his mother for 17 years. Came up, he had made a long journey from Colorado, and his mother had come up from a distant province. And he goes up there to the fence, and mom comes up on the other side. And he puts his face up, and he told me later, he could smell her. She could hear his breathing. And he says, I love you. And she says, I miss you. Have you been eating right? Which is every mom's question. And he wants to give her a hug. But all he can do is, the hole in the fence is only large enough to put his pinky finger through. So he puts his pinky finger through, she puts her pinky finger through, and they do this dance of the pinkies, as they call it, the pinky kiss. And all along the fence, you see mothers and sons, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, best friends, doing this pinky kissing, because that's all the touch that the government allow them to do. And they can only meet for 10 or 15 minutes at a time, and the border patrol then tells them, go back. So when you go to Friendship Park, you see the tremendous desire of human beings to be with their families. Family reunification means something. If you've ever had an issue with someone in your family, if you've ever been, had a fight with someone and haven't spoken to them for some time, Go to Friendship Park and see what happens when the state tells you you can't meet your family. See the desperation of these people, the longing for touch. They call it amarge y dulce, amargo y dulce, tender sweet, bittersweet. But it's not just in this country. It's all over Europe. The ghosts of the fascists are coming back. The fear of migrants is doing incalculably more damage to these countries than the migrants ever could. Exhibit A, Brexit, the biggest own goal in British history. Look at what's happening now. The country's tearing itself apart. Scotland, Ireland might go their separate ways. It's based on fear of migrants. But you know what? The people who voted for Brexit, like the people in this country who don't like immigrants, they're not the people who meet immigrants every day. The people who voted for Brexit were white British people who lived in the countryside. The people who don't like immigrants don't live in Jackson Heights. They don't even live in New York. They live in states where, their idea of an immigrant family comes from Tucker Carlson. I really want to go on Tucker Carlson, just so I can call him Taquito. But all these studies show that when people have everyday lived experience of immigrants, they realize that they're just like them. They're admirable people. Immigrants work harder than the native born. Their crime rates are lower than the native born. And in the end, immigration is a good news story. So my book is an angry book, but with a happy ending. And the happy ending is that when people move, everyone benefits. The receiving countries benefit because we're not making enough babies to replace our aging populations. The only way we are going to save our social security systems is by letting in more migrants. The migrants themselves benefit because for many of them it's literally a matter of life and death. And the countries they move from benefit because remittances, the money people send back in $5 and $10 increments, which are these gyro shops all over Jackson Heights. It's the best and most targeted way of helping the global poor. Remittances last year amounted to 4 times the amount of all foreign aid. So I'd like to leave you with this one story of hope. As I said, my book is an angry book, but also a hopeful one. In 2016, that dread year when Trump got elected, my brother-in-law, who my sister also grew up in Jackson Heights, then she married Jay, who's Bengali American, and grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and now they live in Raleigh, North Carolina. So he calls me and says, Suketu, I want to run for state senate. I said, in North Carolina, and you're Bengali, how are you going to support my sister? And he said, no, I think I've got a shot. So I went down there and, I campaigned for him. My 2 sons went down and campaigned for him. And he was running against a white man with the fine old southern name of Ellis Hankins, who's president of the League of North Carolina Municipalities. And there was my brother-in-law, Jay Chowdhury. He had to train his own campaign staff in how to pronounce his last name. It's a district that's 90% white. And the white guy just took it, for granted that he'd get elected. And Jay went out and knocked on doors. His campaign knocked on 14,000 doors. He knocked on 10,000 doors individually. My son had a gun pulled on him when he was campaigning. I had a dog set on me, although it was a small dog, a poodle named Chewy. Chewy, get back here. It was vicious. But we knocked on 10,000 doors, and Jay spoke to people about what was important to them, which was about schools. The Republicans had defunded North Carolina schools. And everyone could respond to this, white or non-white. And you know what? He got elected in a landslide. He is now the Democratic whip in the North Carolina State Senate, the first Indian American senator in North Carolina history. All politics is local. All politics is personal. So we can do it in this country. This land is our land. This country is our country. And don't let anyone, whether it's from Jamaica Estates or elsewhere, tell you otherwise. Thank you.